Keep your eyes down and do your work.
This is the best coffee in this house.
Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm really hoping to break through the magical barrier of 1,000 subscribers. That number holds a special significance for me. Hit that subscribe button. It's just one click, but for me, it's a huge boost of motivation to create my next video. Thank you in advance. The millionaire returned home furious and broke down upon seeing what the maid was doing with his mother. Clean here, shut up here, and don't exist here. Understood? Those were the first words Valentina Cruz heard as she crossed the threshold of the Castellanos mansion. There was no welcome, no introduction, only that voice, sharp as shattered glass, raining down on her from the white marble staircase, where Isabella Fuentes eyed her from head to toe with a smile that wasn't a smile, but perfectly disguised disdain. Valentina was 23, carrying a worn-out suitcase with wobbly wheels and the silent weight of having grown up alone in the world. Orphaned at 9, raised in Mrs. Amparo's home, a good woman who died leaving her no inheritance but the habit of hard work and the custom of never bowing her head. Valentina had learned from childhood that dignity was not for sale, even when her stomach roared with hunger. That's why, when Isabella finished her little welcoming speech with a dismissive gesture that brushed her aside like a fly, Valentina simply responded with a brief, controlled nod and continued walking into the house. The Castellanos mansion was located in the Chapultepec Hills, on an avenue so quiet and so green, it seemed unreal to exist within the same city as the crowded metro and street-side tacos. It was a 3-story, white, geometric structure with enormous windows that let in the morning light in golden streams. There was a pool in the backyard, a small greenhouse filled with orchids, and a garage housing 5 cars of a model Valentina could never have imagined driving. Everything was perfect, everything was cold. Concepcion, the head of domestic staff, a woman around 50, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a permanent expression of someone who has seen too much and learned to offer no opinion, greeted her. She explained the rules in under 4 minutes. Wake up early. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't go to the 3rd floor without authorization. Don't touch anything in the main living room. And, above all, she repeated this twice, don't disturb Mrs. Carmen under any circumstances. Who is Mrs. Carmen? Valentina asked. Concepcion looked at her a second too long before answering. Mr. Rodrigo's mother lives in the East Wing. She has her own nurses on duty, but lately, there's been a pause that contained many things she didn't say. Lately, shifts aren't always covered. Don't get involved. Just clean your area. Valentina nodded, but filed that information away somewhere in her chest, where she kept the things that mattered. Her area turned out to be the entire ground floor, the dining room, the kitchen, the TV room, the West Wing corridors, and the 3 guest bathrooms. It was work for 2 people, perhaps 3, if done leisurely. Valentina would do it alone and without complaint, because that's how she'd been trained, and because she had no other choice. The other maids, Rosario and Jimena, both longtime employees, greeted her with that particular coolness of those who have seen many come and go. They weren't rude. They were simply transparent, as if Valentina were already air, already nothing, someone not worth knowing, because she wouldn't last anyway. The last one they brought lasted 11 days, Rosario told her during the midday break, without looking up from her phone. The one before, 3 weeks. Miss Isabella has a short temper with new people. Thanks for letting me know, Valentina replied, and she meant it, without sarcasm. Rosario looked at her directly for the first time. Something in her expression shifted slightly, like a cloud passing over the sun, illuminating the landscape for a moment, before returning to shadow. I'm just telling you how things are here, she murmured, and said no more. Valentina ate her packed lunch in the service kitchen. A bean sandwich she had prepared that morning in her rented room in Tepito, wrapped in aluminum foil, which was now cold. She didn't complain. She chewed slowly, looking out the small kitchen window at the garden, where the orchids in the greenhouse bloomed in colors that seemed invented. It was then that she heard it for the first time, a faint, intermittent sound coming from the East Wing. It wasn't exactly a cry. It was more like the dry cough of someone who hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. A sound so small that in a house full of life, no one would have noticed. But the Castellanos mansion wasn't full of life. It was full of silence and luxury, which are very different things. Valentina wrapped up the rest of her sandwich, put it in her apron, and followed the sound. The east wing was a long corridor with 3 doors. The first 2 were closed. The third was ajar. Through the crack, Valentina saw a large, bright room with dark wooden furniture and a discreet but present hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment at rest. White linen curtains moved gently by the wind, and in a wheelchair placed by the window, her back to the door, a small, hunched figure gazing out at the garden with the absolute stillness of someone who has given up waiting. Valentina pushed the door open softly. "Mrs. Carmen." The figure in the wheelchair didn't startle. She moved slowly, with the languor of someone who no longer has any hurry, and turned her head slightly to see who had entered. Doña Carmen Castellanos was 84 years old, and had the face of someone who had been a beautiful and strong-willed woman in her youth. That was still evident. Even now, with her white hair tied in a long braid, her skin papery with fine wrinkles, and dark eyes that looked with disturbing lucidity, as if the body aged, but the consciousness inside remained intact and observant. "You're new," she said. Her voice was hoarse but firm. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Valentina. I arrived this morning." "Ah." The old woman turned her gaze back to the garden. "So, they haven't told you yet that you shouldn't come here." "They told me," Valentina replied, "but I heard you, and wanted to make sure you were all right." A silence, long, of the kind that isn't awkward, but thoughtful. "All right with what?" Doña Carmen finally asked, with a tone that could have been bitter, but turned out to be simply tired. "All right in health. I'm alive. I suppose that counts. All right in spirits. It's been 6 weeks since my son has set foot in this room. You tell me if that's all right." Valentina said nothing for a moment. She looked at the elderly woman, looked at the room, looked at the glass of water on the bedside table, which was empty, and looked at the plate, with what had been breakfast, half-eaten gelatin, and a cup of tea that must have been cold for hours. "Can I bring you something to eat?" she asked. "Something hot, I mean. Really hot." Doña Carmen looked at her directly for the first time. She studied her with those dark, intelligent eyes, and on her face, a face accustomed to showing nothing, there appeared for an instant an expression that Valentina recognized because she had seen it many times in the mirror of her own life. The small, almost painful astonishment of someone who didn't expect anyone to ask that. "It's been a long time since anyone offered me anything like that," the old woman said, almost to herself. "Then it was time," Valentina replied simply, and went to the kitchen to heat whatever was available. What was available was little. Yesterday's rice, some chicken broth Rosario had left in the refrigerator, and some pasilla chilies that Valentina didn't have authorization to use, but used anyway, with the clear conscience of someone who knows there are more important things than permissions. In 20 minutes, she had prepared a bowl of hot broth with rice, mild chilies, and a tortilla freshly heated on the comal. The comal she found hidden at the bottom of the lower drawer, as if it hadn't been used in years in this luxurious kitchen, where everything was modern and nothing was loving. When she returned to Doña Carmen's room with the tray, the old woman was waiting for her, the wheelchair turned towards the door, as if she already knew Valentina would return, as if she had decided to believe her. Valentina placed the tray on the table, brought the chair closer, and stood to the side as the lady took her first sip of broth. She saw the old woman's eyes close slightly, that involuntary gesture when something tastes familiar, something that smells of home, of something you no longer expected to find. "My mother used to make broth like this," Doña Carmen murmured, "with the whole chili in it, not chopped, to give flavor, but not heat." "That's how they taught me too," Valentina said. "Who taught you?" "A woman who looked after me as a child. She's gone now, but I remember her every time I cook." Doña Carmen nodded slowly, as if she understood that perfectly, as if she too carried memories that accompanied her, even if there was no one there to see her. Did they eat? Well, the old woman ate, and Valentina was present, which is another way of eating, in a silence that didn't need to be filled with words. Outside, in the garden, a bird sang something brief and urgent. The orchids in the greenhouse shone under the 2 p.m. sun. Valentina knew, at that moment, with the simple certainty of true things, that she was not going to abandon this woman, even if it cost her her job, even if it cost her everything. "Miss Valentina, can you explain to me what on earth you are doing in the East Wing at this hour?" Concepcion's voice sounded behind her like a bucket of cold water, cutting through the corridor's silence. At 7 a.m. on the 3rd day, Valentina stopped. She held in her hands a tray with freshly brewed black coffee, 2 pieces of sweet bread, a pink concha and a horn, and a small vase with a single jasmine branch she had cut from the garden before dawn, when no one could see her yet. "I'm bringing Mrs. Carmen breakfast," Valentina replied, still not turning, with the calmness of someone who had already thought of her answer before being asked. "That is not your job. The lady has her nurse on duty." "The nurse on duty didn't come today, nor did she come yesterday." "Someone has to bring her breakfast." She turned now, looking at Concepcion directly. Concepcion looked at her with that tight, difficult expression that adults have when a young person is right, and they don't want to admit it. She opened her mouth, closed it. She observed the tray, the coffee, the bread, the jasmine. She made a strange movement with her lips that could have been the beginning of a smile. "Finish quickly," she said. "You still have the guest bathrooms pending." And she left down the corridor without another word. Valentina continued walking towards Doña Carmen's room, with a small, warm victory settling in her chest. The following days turned into a parallel routine that Valentina built with care and stealth. How anything valuable that the world isn't ready to see yet is built. In the mornings, she arrived early, 40 minutes before her official start time, to prepare Mrs. Carmen's breakfast before beginning her duties. It wasn't much. Scrambled eggs with epazote, when there was oatmeal with cinnamon, fruit chopped with lime, or simply the leftover breads from the main kitchen, warmed with butter, but she presented them carefully on the good tray, with the coffee, just as she had learned the old woman liked it. Black, without sugar, very hot, with a pinch of cinnamon that the lady didn't ask for, but always noticed. "You put cinnamon in it," Doña Carmen said one morning on the third sip. "Does it bother you?" "I love it, but I hadn't told you so you could discover it yourself." Valentina smiled. Doña Carmen did too, although she did it to the side, as if smiling directly at someone was a gesture she had forgotten how to make. In the afternoons, when the main work of the day was done, and the rest of the staff settled into that slow calm that grandes casas have after 4, Valentina would return to the east wing. Sometimes she brought something with her, a glass of hibiscus water, a magazine she'd found abandoned in the living room, or nothing at all, just herself, which was sometimes enough. She took Doña Carmen to the garden for the first time on the 4th day. She had to push the wheelchair carefully over the threshold of the glass door, which was heavy, and whose mechanism was half stuck from disuse. The old woman said nothing as they crossed the corridor, nor as they descended the side ramp that someone had installed at some point, and which was covered in dry leaves, evidence that no one had used it for months. But when they emerged into the garden and the afternoon sun fell on her face, that soft, golden light of 5 that no longer stings but still warms, Doña Carmen closed her eyes and breathed deeply. A long silence. A silence that was good. "How long?" she finally said, without opening her eyes. "How long what?" Valentina asked, sitting on the stone bench beside her, not getting up. A pause. "Months, I think. Maybe more. One loses count when the days are all the same." Valentina didn't answer. She had learned that Doña Carmen didn't always want answers. Sometimes, she just wanted someone to be there while she voiced her thoughts aloud. The orchids in the greenhouse, which Valentina had admired from the kitchen window, turned out to be the old woman's forgotten passion. She knew because, as they passed the glass greenhouse, Doña Carmen reached out and touched the glass with her fingertips, like someone touching something that was once theirs, and no longer feels like it belongs to them. "I planted them," she said. "About 20 years ago. I started with 3 pots. Now there are over 40 varieties. Though I don't go in anymore, I can't bend down." "Tomorrow we'll go in," Valentina said. "The greenhouse has a step at the entrance. Tomorrow, we'll hop over it." Doña Carmen glanced at her sideways with an expression that Valentina was beginning to recognize. Half skepticism, half hope. The exact mixture of someone who has been disappointed so many times that they no longer allow themselves to hope completely, but who also hasn't entirely stopped doing so. "You are very stubborn," the old woman said. "I've been told that," Valentina replied. That Thursday, Rodrigo Castellanos called from who knew where. Concepcion said he was in a meeting in Monterrey. Jimena said he was in Los Angeles. Rosario simply shrugged with the gesture of someone who has stopped keeping track of the master's travels. The call was brief. Instructions regarding an event to be held the following month at the mansion. Details from Catherine to be coordinated with the external chef, and confirmation that Isabella would be there that afternoon to oversee the general state of the house. He asked nothing about his mother. Valentina was in the kitchen when Concepcion hung up the phone. She saw on her face that small, expressionless grimace, of someone who is no longer surprised. Neither of them said anything, but Valentina gripped the kitchen towel in her hands with a force that wasn't for cleaning anything, but for containing something. Isabella arrived at 5:15. She entered through the main door like a cold wind. High heels, a camel-colored leather bag that was probably worth more than Valentina's quarterly salary. Dark hair, perfectly straight, an expression of permanent supervision that measured everything based on whether what she saw made her look good or bad. She moved through the living room, the dining room, the kitchen. She made 3 comments in 4 minutes. That the corridor floor had stains, that the arrangement of the sofa cushions was incorrect, and that the vase in the foyer had flowers that were already wilting. Valentina listened to the 3 comments standing with her hands clasped in front of her, blinking no more than necessary. "You are the new one," Isabella said, looking at her with that kind of attention that is not interest but inventory. "Yes, Miss Valentina Cruz." "Ah!" Isabella paused deliberately. The kind of pause one makes, not because one needs to think, but so the other person feels the weight of the silence. "And you have been going into the East Wing." Valentina didn't move a muscle. "I have been bringing Mrs. Carmen her breakfast when the nurse on duty has been able to assist." "No one asked you to do that." "No, but no one was bringing Mrs. Carmen her breakfast." The silence that followed had edges. Isabella took a step closer. She was taller than Valentina in her heels, and she used that extra inch of height, just as one uses any advantage, without pretense. "Listen to me carefully," she said in a low voice that was more threat than volume. "You clean, you tend, you dust, and you keep quiet. It is not your job to get involved with the family. It is not in your interest to overstep your duties, and especially not in your interest to give ideas to an old woman who already has everything she needs to be well cared for. Is that clear?" "Clear," Valentina replied. "Good." Isabella stepped back, picked up her bag from the armchair where she had left it. "Tomorrow, I want the corridor floors without a single stain." And she left the way she had entered, leaving in the air that expensive perfume that some people have, who confuse money with the right to treat others badly. Valentina waited until the sound of the heels disappeared completely. Then she went to the service bathroom, locked the door, sat on the edge of the sink, and breathed. She didn't cry. It wasn't that kind of night. She just breathed long and slowly, as Mrs. Amparo had taught her when she was a child, and the world became too heavy. 3 counts in, 3 counts out, and then carry on. She carried on. That night, almost in the dark, she returned to Doña Carmen's room to collect the dinner tray. The old woman was still awake, a blanket over her legs and an old book open on the bedside table. Although Valentina noticed that the bookmark was on the same page as 3 days prior. "Has Isabella left?" Doña Carmen asked without looking up from her book. "Yes, ma'am. Did she say anything to you?" A pause. "She told me to do my job well." Doña Carmen closed the book. She looked at her with those dark eyes that saw everything. "Valentina, ma'am, you are more my daughter than anyone else in this house." She said it without drama, without embellishment, with the simplicity of things that are so true they need no wrapping. "And I want you to know, even if you don't come back tomorrow, even if they fire you tonight, I want you to know." Valentina felt something gently break in the center of her chest. Not from sadness, from something else. From that nameless thing that happens when someone truly sees you after a long time of being invisible. "They won't fire me," she finally said with a small smile. "Not that easily." Doña Carmen nodded as if she already knew that. "Good night, mija." It was the first time anyone had called her that in many years. Valentina turned off the light, closed the door carefully, and walked down the dark corridor of the mansion, with her heart fuller than when she had entered. "Tonight you will serve dinner, and if you spill a single drop on the table, I swear I will deduct it from your salary down to the last cent." Isabella said it at 3 in the afternoon, with the same naturalness with which other people say good morning, while she examined the floral arrangement in the dining room, without bothering to look at Valentina. The news that there would be a formal dinner that night with guests, something no one had informed her of beforehand, came with a list of handwritten instructions on perfumed paper, ironed uniforms, white gloves, a 7-course service, wines uncorked at the exact temperature, and an express prohibition against speaking to the diners, unless it was to answer a direct question. Valentina took the paper, read it, folded it carefully, and put it in her apron. "Is there anything else, miss?" "Yes, change your hairstyle. That bun makes you look very countrified." Valentina said nothing. She returned to the kitchen and began to prepare for the evening, With the same silent concentration with which an athlete prepares for a competition they know is lost before it begins, but that they will run anyway because that is their character. Rodrigo Castellanos arrived at 7:45 in the evening. Valentina saw him enter from the service corridor through the slightly ajar door that led to the main foyer. It was the first time she had seen him in person, because in the 10 days she had been at the mansion, he had not set foot in the house even once. She had heard his name spoken by others with respect, with fear, with that peculiar mixture that exists when someone has enough money that people don't know exactly how to feel about them. But seeing him was different. He was tall, around 40, with the build of someone who once exercised with discipline and now only had time for work. Navy blue suit, tie loosened since the airport, large hands with a watch that Valentina couldn't identify, but which radiated the kind of price that isn't spoken aloud. He had the face of men who have forgotten when they last genuinely laughed at something. A functional, efficient face, built to solve problems and close deals, not to be at home. Isabella greeted him in the foyer with a kiss on the cheek and a welcoming smile that Valentina observed from afar, with the cold objectivity of someone who has learned to read people before they open their mouths. It was a smile of management, not affection. The smile of someone protecting an investment. The guests arrived shortly after. 3 couples, all in their 40s and 50s, with the polished and slightly bored look of people who have had money long enough not to be excited by anything anymore. Dinner began at 8:30. Valentina served. She did it well, with precision, with discretion, without noise, moving around the long dining room table with that trained invisibility that good service staff possess, always being where needed, never where in the way, existing only as a function. It was during the second course, a pumpkin flour soup with cream that the external chef had prepared that afternoon, that it happened. Valentina approached the place of one of the guests, a man in a gray suit who was gesturing as he spoke. And at the exact moment she tilted the tureen to serve him, the man extended his arm to the side to emphasize some point in his conversation. His elbow hit Valentina's wrist. Just a little, just enough. The soup spilled. Not all of it, just a fine, almost imperceptible thread onto the white tablecloth next to the guest's plate. A small accident, of the kind that occurs in any scene when there is movement, and there are people, and basic physics are operating in the world. But Isabella saw it. Valentina, her voice cut through the conversation at the table like a knife. Everyone fell silent. Everyone looked. "What the hell are you doing?" The heat rose to Valentina's face all at once. That involuntary and unjust heat of shame that comes from outside, not from within. She remained standing. She didn't bend down. "It was an accident, miss. I apologize," she said, looking at the guest, not at Isabella. "An accident," Isabella repeated, with an intonation that turned the words into their opposite. "Of course. Like everything with you." She turned to the guests with an apologetic smile that was perfect in its falseness. "Please excuse me. New staff always have an adjustment period." Some people at the table smiled uncomfortably. The man in the gray suit, the one who had moved his arm, opened his mouth as if to say something, perhaps to acknowledge his part in the accident. But Isabella was already speaking again. She had already moved the conversation elsewhere. She had already buried the moment under a layer of social chatter that no one was going to excavate. Valentina dabbed the stain on the tablecloth with a cloth, removed the soup tureen, and continued serving. She said nothing more. Rodrigo, who had observed everything from the head of the table, said nothing either. What Valentina didn't know was that Rodrigo had watched her throughout the entire dinner. Not in the way a man watches a young woman, but in another, harder-to-name way. The way one watches something that doesn't fit with what one expected to see, and doesn't know what to do with that information. He had noticed the way she moved with precision but without stiffness, the calm that wasn't her role, and above all, he had noticed how she handled the moment with the soup, without crying, without arguing, without playing the victim. She had held her ground, shoulders still, gaze steady, and that was a rare thing in someone who had just been humiliated in front of 6 strangers. But Rodrigo was a man who had built his life on the premise that emotions are processed later, when the agenda allows. So he filed the observation away and returned to his business conversation. The guests left at 11:15. Valentina finished clearing the table past midnight. She washed, tidied, put things away, turned off the dining room lights one by one. As she passed the corridor of the East Wing, she hesitated for a second. It was late. The señora should be asleep. It made no sense. But her feet carried her there anyway, because there are things the body knows how to do without asking permission from reason. She pushed the door open gently. Doña Carmen was not asleep. She sat in her wheelchair by the window in the darkness, looking out at the garden, which shimmered faintly under the moonlight. When Valentina switched on the small lamp on the bedside table, the old woman turned her head and saw her, and on her face was something Valentina could only describe as relief. "I knew you would come," Doña Carmen said. "I came to see how you were," Valentina replied, entering and closing the door. I heard voices, laughter, a pause. "Rodrigo was here tonight, wasn't he?" "Yes, señora. There was a dinner with guests." "Did he come up?" Silence. "No, señora." Doña Carmen nodded slowly, with that acceptance that isn't resignation but something worse, habit. The habit of the absence of knowing that your son is in the same house, and that this doesn't mean you will see him. "When he was little," the old woman said, looking back towards the window, "he would look for me for everything. For me to fix his knees when he fell, to tell him stories, to listen when he was afraid of the dark." She smiled faintly, but it was a smile that hurt. One doesn't know at what moment children become strangers. It happens so slowly that by the time you realize it, you've gone years without recognizing them. Valentina sat on the edge of the bed, but not too close. "Sometimes people get lost," she said, "not because they want to get lost, but because no one showed them how to find their way back." Doña Carmen looked at her. "Did that happen to you?" "I got lost on my own from a young age, but I found my way back." A pause. "You can always find it." The old woman didn't answer immediately. She looked at Valentina for a long moment, with that deep, calm gaze of eyes that have seen much and no longer rush to judge. Then she extended her hand, a small hand, full of history, full of years, and placed it on Valentina's. "Did they treat you badly tonight?" Valentina asked. She felt the weight of the question. The exact question. The right question. The question no one else in that house had thought to ask. "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't ask if you're fine. I asked if they treated you badly." A long, honest pause. "Yes," Valentina admitted. "A little." Doña Carmen squeezed her hand. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say, "I'll speak to someone." She didn't promise anything she couldn't fulfill. She just squeezed Valentina's hand with her old, firm fingers. And that was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. "Tomorrow you'll take me to see the orchids," the old woman said, changing the subject with the precision of someone who knows when a conversation has said all it needs to say. "You promised me we would jump over the step." "Tomorrow we'll jump over the step," Valentina confirmed. "Good night, dear." "Good night, señora." Valentina turned off the lamp and stepped into the corridor. She walked towards the service quarters in the basement with her usual silent steps, crossing the main hall, where the lights were already off, and the mansion slept its sleep of luxury and solitude. On the stairs leading to the second floor, a figure stood. Rodrigo Castellanos. On the first step, his suit jacket in his hand, his tie hanging loose. He was watching her, not with surprise exactly, but with that expression of someone who has been standing there for a while, waiting to see something, and has just seen it. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second. Valentina tilted her head slightly, the professional gesture, the correct gesture, and continued walking. Rodrigo said nothing, but he didn't avert his gaze until she disappeared down the service corridor. "Valentina, I need you to help me with something you can't tell anyone." It was 2 p.m. on a gray Tuesday, one of those days when Mexico City smells of impending rain, and the air has a density that weighs differently on one's shoulders. Valentina was finishing sweeping the East Wing corridor when Doña Carmen uttered those words from her slightly ajar doorway, her voice low, and with a firmness that was not that of the frail old woman the rest of the house believed her to be, but of the woman she had once been, and who Valentina knew still was. Valentina leaned the broom against the wall and entered. Doña Carmen's room was as it always was, tidy, bright, with that mix of medical comfort and personal dignity that the old woman had managed to maintain through sheer force of character. But there was something different that afternoon. On the bed, laid out with care, was a dark, long, flat wooden box with small flowers carved into the lid. A box Valentina hadn't seen before, which must have been stored somewhere in the closet where no one looked for it. "Sit down," Doña Carmen said. Valentina sat on the edge of the wicker chair that was always by the window. "That box," the old woman said, her eyes not leaving Valentina's, "I bought it in Oaxaca, 40 years ago, at a market that no longer exists. A woman who made custom boxes for storing important things was selling them. I asked her for the biggest one she had. She paused, for she had many important things to store. Valentina waited. She had learned that Doña Carmen reached her points by her own paths, and that rushing her was a form of disrespect. "Open it," the old woman said. Inside were letters, many, tied in bundles with ribbons of different colors: blue, green, yellow, red, as if each color corresponded to a different period, a different stage, a different version of the same story, told from different moments in time. Valentina looked at them without touching, with the instinctive respect one has for things that belong to another person's intimacy. "They are letters for Rodrigo," Doña Carmen said. "I started writing them when he was 32, and we first grew distant after his father died, and he decided that grief was a luxury he couldn't afford." A long, laden pause. "I wrote them for years, every time I felt something I needed to tell him, and there was no way to tell him in person, because he wouldn't answer the phone, or because when he came to see me he only talked about business, or because—" She stopped, took a breath. "Because there are things one doesn't know how to say face to face, but that written down find their way." "He knows about them?" Valentina asked. "He knows they exist." "No, I never sent them." Doña Carmen's voice didn't tremble as she said it, but it carried the weight of things that had been carried alone for too long. "At first, because I thought I would give them to him in person someday. Then, because time kept passing, and the moment never came. And then they simply became the only place where I could be honest." Valentina looked at the box, the bundles of letters, the colored ribbons. "How many are there?" she asked. "I haven't counted them many. 12 years of letters, Valentina. 12 years of things your son doesn't know about his own mother." The silence that followed was the kind that holds its own weight, that doesn't ask to be filled with words because words wouldn't fit. "Why are you showing them to me?" Valentina finally asked, carefully. Doña Carmen looked at her, and in her dark eyes was something Valentina took a moment to identify because it was a complex mixture: urgency and fear and hope and weariness, all together, as happens to people when they feel time is running out and there are still things unresolved. "Because there is something else," the old woman said. "Something you need to know. Something Isabella doesn't want Rodrigo to know." Doña Carmen asked her to open the bedside table drawer. Below, beneath a worn Bible and a framed photo of a young woman, whom Valentina recognized as a 30-year-old version of the same old woman before her. There was a thin manila folder with 3 documents inside. Valentina carefully pulled it out. The first was a medical report dated 3 months ago, with the letterhead of a private clinic in the south of the city. Valentina was not a doctor, but she had cared for Señora Amparo in her last years and knew how to read a diagnosis. What she read in that document tightened her chest. "Moderate cardiac arrhythmia with risk of progression. Recommendation for constant monitoring, adjustment of medication, and biweekly follow-up with a specialist cardiologist." The second document was a sheet with the cardiologist's name, her contact number, and a record of appointments. 4 appointments scheduled, 4 missed. The first cancellation had a handwritten note in the margin with a script Valentina didn't recognize as Señora Carmen's. "Miss Isabella informed that the attending physician no longer considers follow-up necessary." The third was a receipt from a pharmacy. "Medications for arrhythmia," dated 2 months ago. The last receipt. Valentina raised her eyes from the documents and looked at Doña Carmen. "Rodrigo knows about this?" "No," the old woman said with a calm that was more terrifying than tears. "Dr. Herrera, who was my doctor all my life, was replaced 4 months ago. Isabella said it was more efficient to have a company doctor, someone the master trusted. Since then, the new doctor comes once a month, takes my blood pressure, says I'm fine, and leaves. The appointments with the cardiologist were canceled, without Rodrigo knowing, and the specific medications for my heart." She paused. "They haven't been refilled for 2 months. The cold Valentina felt was not from temperature, but from understanding exactly what she was seeing. "Why haven't you told Rodrigo? I've tried to speak to him twice by phone. Both times he told me he was in a meeting and would call me back." A pause. "He didn't call. And the nurse, the one who misses her shifts, the original nurse was Miss Veronese, 13 years with me. Isabella fired her 3 months ago. Said her references weren't adequate. The new ones the agency sends." Doña Carmen made a small gesture with her hand, a gesture that said everything without saying anything. "They come when they can. Valentina placed the documents on the bed very carefully, as if they were fragile. She looked at them for a moment, then looked at the old woman. "Do you have the previous medications? Are there any tablets left?" "A few, in the top drawer." Valentina found them. A small, almost empty bottle, with a pharmacy label on which the name of the medication, the dosage, and the name of the cardiologist who had prescribed it could be read. "Tomorrow I'll call this doctor," Valentina said. "Isabella won't allow it." "Tomorrow I'll call this doctor," Valentina repeated, her voice not raised, but unyielding. "And then we'll see what happens next." Doña Carmen studied it for a moment. Then, very slowly, she nodded. Valentina didn't sleep well that night. She lay on her cot in the service room, staring at the low concrete ceiling, the medical report vivid in her memory, and a question that wouldn't be silenced. What does a person with no power do when they discover something that only someone with all the power can resolve? She thought of Rodrigo, of the look he had given her on the stairs that dinner night, that he wasn't a bad man. Exactly. Bad men don't have that kind of look. That look of someone who has lost something and doesn't know what it is yet. He was an absent man. A man who had convinced himself that providing financially was enough, that paying for the mansion and the staff and the nurses was a form of love, and that no one had yet told him, or no one he would listen to, that love is not a transaction. She thought of the dark wooden box, the colored ribbons, 12 years of letters a son had not read. She thought of Mrs. Amparo, who had died with things left unsaid, because no one had asked her in time, and she made a decision. She wasn't going to wait. She wasn't going to stand by with her arms crossed while Doña Carmen's health deteriorated in silence behind closed doors. It wasn't her place, perhaps. It was definitely not her authority, but there were things that went beyond place and authority. There were things that were simply the right thing to do. She would call the cardiologist, she would find a way for Rodrigo to know, and if it cost her the job, she knew it could cost her the job, she would accept it, because she had learned from childhood that the only thing no one can take away from you is how you look at yourself in the mirror each morning. She closed her eyes. Outside, in the mansion's garden, it began to rain. A soft, continuous rain, the kind that in Mexico City can last all night. Valentina heard the sound of water against the small basement windows, and strangely felt something akin to calm, not because things were okay, but because she now knew what she had to do. And knowing what you have to do, even if it's scary, is always better than not knowing. "Valentina! Valentina! Come, please!" Concepcion's cry cut through the pre-dawn silence like an alarm. It was 3:15 in the morning. Valentina went from asleep to on her feet in less than 2 seconds. That ancient reflex of someone who has cared for someone ill and learned to wake up completely without a margin of drowsiness. And she was already running down the basement corridor before finishing tying her second shoe. Concepcion waited for her at the east wing door, her face distraught, something Valentina had never seen on that woman with her tightly pulled bun, who seemed built not to fall apart. "Mrs. Carmen," Concepcion said. "The nurse on duty found her on the floor. She says she fell out of her chair, but I think it's her heart." Valentina didn't wait any longer. She entered Doña Carmen's room. She was on the floor next to the bed, sitting against the side of the mattress, her right hand on her chest, her breathing rapid and shallow, the kind of breathing that doesn't provide enough air, even though it looks like she's breathing. Her lips were slightly bluish, her eyes open, lucid, terrified. Not of dying, but of that specific fear of the body ceasing to obey. The nurse on duty, a girl no older than 25, who clearly hadn't seen a cardiac emergency in her life, stood to the side with the phone in her hand, not quite knowing what to do with it. "Call 911 now," Valentina told her, her voice not shouting, but not admitting of discussion. "Tell them cardiac arrhythmia. An 84-year-old woman, unconscious, no, but with cyanosis on the lips, and tachycardia. Give the full address, and don't hang up until they arrive." The nurse obeyed. Concepcion remained at the door. Valentina knelt beside Doña Carmen. "Señora, I'm here. I hear you. Look at me." The old woman's dark eyes met Valentina's. In them, there was fear, yes, but also something else. Relief. The relief of not being alone in the moment the body decides to fail. "I can't," Doña Carmen began. "Don't talk, breathe slowly, with me." Valentina took her hand, the one not on her chest, and breathed with her, setting the rhythm, slow and deep. In and out, in and out. With her free hand, she searched for the medicine bottle she had seen in the drawer, the one that was almost empty, and checked the label. She also found a sublingual nitroglycerin pill that the cardiologist had prescribed for emergencies, exactly like this, kept in a small envelope taped to the inside of the drawer, with a note in medical handwriting that said, "In case of acute episode, administer under the tongue, no more than one. Señora, I'm going to put this under your tongue. It's what your doctor prescribed, do you understand?" Doña Carmen barely nodded. Valentina administered the pill with steady hands, then continued to hold her, continued to breathe with her, continued to be there on the floor of the elegant, cold room, without letting go, counting the seconds between each of the old woman's breaths, like someone counting the only thing that matters at that moment. The ambulance arrived in 16 minutes. In those 16 minutes, Valentina made 3 decisions she knew would have consequences. The first was calling the cardiologist. It was 3 a.m., and the number she had was for the office, not a personal one. But she found the hospital's emergency contact number, to which the doctor was affiliated, in the same document and called there, explaining the situation with the exact terms of the medical record she had memorized in recent days, and managed to get the hospital to notify the specialist. The second was searching the room's phone for an old landline, the kind no one uses anymore, which Doña Carmen kept, because she refused to depend on a cell phone, for Rodrigo's number. She found it written in a small blue-covered address book, in the careful handwriting of someone who notes important things to not forget them, even if they know them by heart. She dialed. It rang 4 times. 5. Voicemail. Valentina left a clear, direct message, without drama, but without softening anything. "Mr. Castellanos, this is Valentina Cruz, your housekeeper. Your mother had a cardiac crisis early this morning. The ambulance is on its way. They are taking her to Hospital Ángeles del Pedregal. Please come." The third decision was the hardest. When the paramedics arrived and began preparing Doña Carmen for transport, Isabella appeared at the bedroom door. Silk robe, bathrobe, an expression of someone who has just been woken up and is calibrating the situation based on her own interests. And she saw Valentina standing by the gurney, with the blue address book in her hand, and the phone still warm. "What did you do?" Isabella said in that low, dangerous voice she used when she was more threat than anger. "I called 911 and notified Mr. Rodrigo," Valentina replied. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. "No one gave you authorization to call Rodrigo. Your mother was dying. That no one gave you authorization." Isabella's voice rose, but the paramedics were there, moving efficiently, and there was a limit to what could be done at that moment, without looking bad in front of witnesses. "When this is over," Isabella said, lowering her voice again, taking a step closer, "you will collect your things and leave this house." "Did you hear me?" "I don't care right now," Valentina said. And it was true. At that moment, as the paramedics secured Doña Carmen on the gurney and the old woman searched for her hand with her outstretched fingers, the only thing Valentina cared about was that, not letting go of that hand until the last possible second. She let go of it at the ambulance door. Doña Carmen looked at her from inside, already connected to a monitor, already with oxygen, already surrounded by people who knew what they were doing, and with her eyes, she said something that needed no words. "Thank you. Not just for tonight, but for everything." The ambulance doors closed. Valentina stood in the entrance of the mansion in the cold pre-dawn, watching the red lights recede down the avenue. The hospital was 20 minutes away by ambulance, by taxi. At that hour, with no traffic, 15. Valentina didn't have authorization to go to the hospital. She had no official reason to be there. She was the domestic employee, not family. She was no one, in the terms the world uses to measure who has the right to be where. But she thought of Doña Carmen's hand, searching for hers, and called a taxi. She arrived at the hospital at 4 a.m. and sat in the emergency waiting room, still in her apron, because she hadn't had time to change. There were 3 other people waiting, an elderly gentleman asleep on his own hand, a young woman with a baby in her arms, and a nurse eating a sandwich sitting in the hallway. Valentina waited. At 5:10 a.m., Rodrigo Castellanos arrived. He entered through the emergency room doors with yesterday's tie still on, his suit wrinkled, and on his face an expression Valentina had never seen. Not the face of the businessman, not the face of the mansion owner, but something deeper beneath it all, something unpolished, unmanaged, the face of a son. He saw her before he saw anyone else. He stopped. "You," he said. "Me," Valentina replied, standing. "How is my mother?" "In stabilization. The doctor came out 20 minutes ago and said she responded well to initial treatment, but he needs to speak with you." There are things about her condition that you don't know. Rodrigo looked at her with that concentrated intensity of men who process things quickly and need all the data before reacting. What things? She has a cardiac arrhythmia diagnosed 3 months ago. Her appointments with the cardiologist were canceled. The specific medications haven't been refilled for 2 months. A brief pause. There are documents. They're in her room. I recommend you review them before speaking with the doctor. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of the room. Rodrigo Castellanos, the man who closed million-dollar deals without his voice trembling. The man who had learned not to feel anything in public because feeling was a form of losing. He blinked only once, but in that blink was everything. The understanding, the blow, the beginning of something that still had no name, but was going to be big. "Why do you know all this?" he finally asked, his voice lower than before. "Because someone had to know it," Valentina replied simply. At that moment, the emergency room doctor emerged through the swinging doors, searching with his eyes for the patient's family member. Rodrigo turned towards him. The medical conversation began, technical and urgent, and Valentina retreated to her chair in the waiting room to give them space. But before Rodrigo followed the doctor, he turned towards her for a moment. He said nothing, just looked at her. With that new look, without the veneer of authority, without the learned distance, a look that asked things he didn't yet know how to formulate into words. Valentina barely nodded, a small gesture that said, "Go on, I'm here." Rodrigo followed the doctor, and Valentina sat in the hospital waiting room at 5 a.m., still in her apron, her eyes open, waiting without anyone having asked her to, because some things don't need to be asked. Outside, the city began to wake up. The first bus of the day roared down the avenue. Someone turned on the lights of a tortilleria on the corner across the street. The sky above the hospital began to change from black to that dark blue that precedes dawn, that color that is not yet day, but already promises to be. Valentina closed her eyes for a moment, and for the first time in a long time, she felt that she had done exactly the right thing. "How long have you been working in my house?" It was 7 a.m. The waiting room had changed shifts. Rodrigo had sat down in the chair next to Valentina, not facing her, but beside her, which said something, holding 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine, that at 7 a.m., after a sleepless night, taste better than anything. He offered her one, without asking if she wanted it. Valentina took it. 16 days, Rodrigo replied. He nodded slowly, looking at his own cup. "In 16 days, you learned more about my mother's medical condition than I did in 3 months." It wasn't a question, nor exactly an accusation. It was something more akin to a man aloud tallying the scope of his own mistake. "I had time to be with her," Valentina said carefully. "You didn't. That's not an apology." "I didn't say it as an apology. I said it as an explanation." Rodrigo looked at her with that intensity of men who process quickly and need all the data. There was something in the way this woman spoke, without embellishments, without the excessive deference of the rest of the staff, that unsettled him in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, but strange. Like when you walk into a familiar room and something has been moved, and it takes you a moment to identify what. The doctor says if another 2 or 3 weeks had gone by without the right medication, Rodrigo didn't finish the sentence. "I know," Valentina said. Another silence. The hospital sounds surrounded them. Footsteps, gurneys, voices over the intercom, the constant, neutral hum of places where life gets serious. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Rodrigo asked when he discovered the situation with the medication, when he saw the documents. Valentina thought about the answer before giving it. "I tried to find a way, but you weren't at the house, and the 2 times you called, you only spoke with Concepcion about logistics." A pause. "And there were people in that house who didn't want you to know." The air between them shifted with that last sentence. Rodrigo didn't ask who she was referring to. He didn't need to. There were things he already knew, but had preferred not to examine too closely. And this morning, in this hospital, with bad vending machine coffee in hand, and the face of a man who hadn't slept, he could no longer go on without examining them. "Go back to the house," he said finally. "Don't pack your things. Go back and wait. We need to talk when I return." "Mr. Castellanos," Valentina said, "Miss Isabella told me last night to pack my things." "Isabella doesn't pay your salary," Rodrigo replied, his voice flat and definitive, the kind that doesn't need to be raised to make it clear there's no room for argument. "I do. Go back to the house." Valentina returned to the mansion on the first metro of the morning, squeezed between workers with thermoses of coffee and headphones on, still in her apron, and her spirits, strangely, firmer than ever. The mansion was in that state of houses that have lived through a nocturnal emergency. Lights on in the east wing, Doña Carmen's room open, the bed unmade, a faint mark on the floor where the paramedics had been. Valentina cleaned, not because it was her job at that moment, but because it was what needed to be done. She made the bed with clean sheets from the closet, picked up the glass of water from the night before, straightened the framed photo of the young woman Doña Carmen had been 50 years ago, which had fallen from the nightstand during the emergency. She found the blue agenda on the floor where it had landed, when Rodrigo had taken it mentally without physically removing it, and put it back in its place next to the landline phone. And then she saw the box, the dark wooden box with carved flowers that Doña Carmen had left open on the bed before the previous night's crisis. There were bundles of letters tied with colored ribbons, 12 years of words a son had not read. Valentina carefully closed the box, placed it on the nightstand where it could be seen upon entering the room, and went out to continue her day. Rodrigo arrived at the mansion at 11 a.m. Valentina heard him enter from the kitchen, where she was preparing something to eat, not for herself, but out of habit, to keep her hands busy when her head was spinning too much. She heard his steps in the foyer, then on the stairs, then in the east wing corridor. Steps that stopped. Silence. Valentina turned off the heat under the pot and waited. The steps didn't descend for a long time. When Rodrigo finally appeared at the kitchen door, Valentina knew immediately that something had changed in him. It wasn't visible in his clothes. He was still in the same suit from the night before, even more wrinkled, nor exactly in his face, but in the way he stood, as if he had lost some of that vertical weight that men accustomed to controlling everything possess. That weight that seems like strength, but is sometimes just accumulated tension over years. In his hands, he held the open, dark wooden box, with one of the bundles of letters between his fingers, the one with the blue ribbon, the oldest. "Did you know about this?" his mother asked. "She showed it to me," Valentina replied. "She told me they were letters for you." Rodrigo looked at the box, looked at the letters, looked at Valentina with that new expression of a man who has just read something he wasn't prepared to read, not with anger, but with that kind of honest disorientation of someone who discovers the map they carried doesn't match the real territory. "I've been reading them since I arrived," he said. "For hours. 12 years of her life that I didn't see." Valentina said nothing. There were moments when silence was the only dignified response. "She tells me about when I had pneumonia at 34 and didn't let her come to the hospital," he said, his voice carrying physical weight. "She tells me about the Christmas I spent in New York, about things I don't remember happening, and that she kept here for 12 years because she couldn't find another place to put them." "Sometimes children don't know what they're doing," Valentina said. "Not because they're bad, but because no one teaches them to see what isn't shouting." Rodrigo looked at her. "And you do know how to see that." "I learned out of necessity," Valentina said. "When you grow up alone, you learn to read what people don't say." Isabella arrived at 12:30. Valentina knew it by the sound of her heels in the foyer, that rhythm she already recognized as that of someone generating tension before appearing. From the foyer, voices reached them. Isabella's, controlled at first, calibrated, the tone of someone constructing a narrative. And then Rodrigo's, low, without the volume of rage but with something more difficult to manage, the coldness of someone who has already made a decision. Valentina didn't hear Drede, but the mansion was large, and the footsteps told their own story. Isabella's moving. Rodrigo's still. The study door closing. 40 minutes later, Rodrigo opened that door. Valentina saw Isabella Fuentes exit with the camel-colored leather bag in her hand, and the first genuine expression Valentina had ever seen on her. Not the practiced smile or the calculated disdain, but something raw, rage or fear, or both. Their eyes met for a second. Just one. Isabella said nothing. The heels echoed farther and farther on the marble, and the main door closed with a firmness that wasn't a slam, but wasn't soft either. Rodrigo appeared in the corridor a moment later, saw Valentina, and stopped. "Come," he said. "I need you to show me my mother's medical documents." They went to Doña Carmen's room together. Valentina took the manila folder from the nightstand drawer, the 3 documents, and gave them to him. Rodrigo read them standing by the window with that absolute concentration of men accustomed to reading contracts and finding the important points, without anyone pointing them out. When he finished, he folded the documents, put them back in the folder, and stood looking out the window at the garden, where the orchids in the greenhouse gleamed under the midday sun. The cardiologist already knows what happened, Valentina said. I called her from here 3 days ago. She agreed to see her as soon as she was discharged. You called her? Yes, without authorization. Without authorization. Rodrigo nodded, still not turning his face, still looking at the garden. Thank you, he said. It was the first time anyone in that mansion had said that to Valentina, without irony, without condition, just that. Thank you, clean and direct, the kind that doesn't need explanation because it carries its own weight. Valentina felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been tight since the first day, since Isabella's words on the marble staircase, since the ranch chongo and the soup tureen and the 16 days of invisibility. When is your mother being discharged, she asked. Tomorrow, if she remains stable. Rodrigo finally turned. He looked at her directly, with that new gaze that no longer had a veneer. I want you to be here when she arrives. I want you to... He searched for the words, and the fact that he searched for them, that he didn't have them ready, said a lot about what was happening to this man. I want things to be different when she returns to this house. Different in every way, he said, starting with there being someone in this house who truly loves her. A pause. And you already are. Valentina didn't respond immediately. She looked around the room, the bed made with the morning's clean sheets, the photo of the young woman back in its place, the dark wooden box with the colored ribbons on the nightstand. Can I ask you something, Mr. Castellanos? Rodrigo, he said. A brief pause. Can I ask you something, Rodrigo? Yes. Are you going to read all the letters? Rodrigo looked at the box for a long moment, with the expression of someone who has just realized the magnitude of something they didn't see in time. All of them, he said, tonight. And in that word was the most important promise he had made in a long time. Not one of contracts, but the promise of a son who finally decides to see. Rodrigo, there's something I need to tell you before your mother comes home. It was early the next morning, when the light had that thin, clean quality of the first 20 minutes before the city awakens. Valentina was in the kitchen preparing a proper breakfast. Huevos a la mexicana, beans, freshly made tortillas, coffee with cinnamon, when Rodrigo came down the stairs in simple clothes and with the eyes of someone who hadn't slept but had been active all night, doing a different kind of work. Did you read all the letters? Valentina asked. All of them, Rodrigo said, with the same weight as the night before. No possibility of turning back. He sat on the stool at the kitchen counter, not in the formal dining room, but there, like people who sit where they feel comfortable, and waited. Your mother is afraid that when she leaves, you'll be left alone, Valentina said. She doesn't tell you directly, she says it between the lines, in the questions she asks when no one is listening. She's afraid that work has emptied you so much that when she's gone, there will be nothing left inside that knows how to be with someone. Silence. Rodrigo looked at her. Not with annoyance, but with the face of someone hearing something they already knew and needed someone to say aloud so they could do something about it. And what do you think? He asked. I think there's still a lot inside. That the problem isn't that you're empty, it's that you've gone so long without opening the door that you no longer remember how to open it. Rodrigo looked at the tortillas on the griddle, the steaming coffee, the jasmine in the vase on the window, all that breakfast prepared with a warmth that hadn't existed in that kitchen before this woman arrived. How do you do it? He asked. Giving without having been given? Valentina thought of Senora Amparo, of the broth she learned to make herself at 12, because sometimes no one came to cook, and they had to eat anyway. You learn that giving is the only thing no one can take away from you, she said. Everything else, yes. But what you give remains with the receiver, and that never disappears. Rodrigo looked at her for a long moment with his gaze now stripped bare, the look of a man seeing something he never expected to find in his own kitchen. My mother is right, he said. You are more of this family than anyone who has ever set foot in this house. Doña Carmen arrived at noon. It was Rodrigo, who went to pick her up from the hospital. Valentina prepared the room while she waited. Fresh flowers, new sheets, the photograph of the young woman in its exact spot, the wooden box with colored ribbons open on the table by the window, and on the bedside table, a small bouquet of orchids cut from the greenhouse. That morning, when the car pulled into the garage, Valentina stayed in the hallway at a safe distance. This was not her moment, it was their moment. She heard the low voices she couldn't decipher, but whose tone said it all, soft, careful, the kind people use when carrying something fragile and precious. Then she heard a silence that lasted long enough for Valentina to know, without seeing anything, that something broken for a long time had begun to mend. They found her in the kitchen, as always. Rodrigo was pushing his mother's wheelchair. Doña Carmen had the blanket over her legs, and her hair gathered in a long braid, and her face held an expression Valentina had not yet seen. Not the usual resigned tranquility, nor the contained joy of her good moments in the garden, but something fuller, more complete, more akin to true peace. The kind that comes when things are finally in their place. When she saw Valentina, she extended her arms. Valentina approached and hugged her carefully. It was a measured embrace, from someone who didn't want to squeeze too hard a body that had just been through a crisis. But Doña Carmen squeezed tightly with that unexpected strength the elderly possess when they hug someone they truly love, as if their bodies stored reserves of energy for exactly that. "My daughter," the old woman said close to her ear. Valentina closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm here now, Señora," she said. "You've come home. We've all arrived," Doña Carmen said, and in that "we all," there was a new geography. Her son, this girl, who had arrived with an old suitcase and wobbly wheels, and had found in a mansion full of marble and silence a way to bring warmth back to rooms where it had faded. Rodrigo, standing by the wheelchair, watched. Valentina glanced at him over Doña Carmen's shoulder, barely a fraction of a second. He nodded, nothing more. A small, still nod that was, in its own way, the gesture of a man learning to open a door he had kept shut for years. That afternoon, the three of them went out to the garden. Rodrigo pushed the chair. Valentina walked alongside. The 4:30 sun turned the garden into something cinematic. The orchids in the greenhouse, the still water of the pool, the trees rustling their leaves in the gentle breeze. Doña Carmen looked at everything. Her face turned towards the sun, like people who have been indoors for a long time and suddenly remember what it's like to have the sky above them. "The step to the greenhouse," the old woman said. "We'll jump it today," Valentina said. "You said that days ago." "Today? For real. We'll remove it tomorrow," Rodrigo said without hesitation. "I'll call whoever needs to be called tonight." Doña Carmen smiled towards the garden, towards nowhere in particular. The smile of someone to whom something small yet important has just been resolved. They reached the greenhouse. Rodrigo maneuvered the chair over the step with more care than Valentina expected. 4 attempts, without impatience at any point. When they entered, Doña Carmen fell silent. The place smelled of damp earth and flowers and thyme. Of all the years the old woman had spent there tending these plants before her body told her she could no longer stoop. The orchids were everywhere, hanging, on shelves, in rows of every color that name suggests. The old woman extended her hand and touched the petals of a dark purple one, almost black. "This is the cattleya," she said. "I planted it the year Rodrigo turned 10. You gave me some seeds from the market. You didn't know what they were. You said you liked the colors." Rodrigo looked at the orchid. Something flickered across his face. A memory. The kind the brain files away in childhood and reappears without warning 40 years later. "I remember," he said, his voice smaller, truer. "I know," Doña Carmen said. "I always knew you remembered." Valentina took a step back towards the door, discreetly, to give them space. She stood with the afternoon sun on her face and that soft sound of the wind in the leaves, which has the power to make everything else seem possible for a moment. 3 weeks later, life in the Castellanos mansion was so unlike what it had been before that Valentina sometimes walked the same marble corridors and had to remind herself it was the same place. Rodrigo had rehired Nurse Berenice with a raise and a direct apology. The cardiologist came every 2 weeks. The greenhouse step had disappeared, replaced by a light wooden ramp installed one Wednesday morning. Breakfasts were eaten in the kitchen, the 3 of them together, when Rodrigo didn't have an early meeting, and he had started having fewer early meetings, enough for Doña Carmen to wait for him without saying so, and for the kitchen to already smell of coffee with cinnamon by the time he arrived. One Tuesday, while Valentina scrambled eggs and Doña Carmen told Rodrigo the story of how she had acquired the rarest orchid in her collection, a story involving a trip to Mérida, a pre-dawn market, and a man in a hat who spoke Mayan, Rodrigo leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at Valentina with that direct, unvarnished expression that had simply become his way of looking when he was in that kitchen. "Valentina," he said. She looked up from the pan. "I want to offer you something." A pause. "Not as an employee, but as part of this house. There's a room on the 2nd floor that's never used. It has a window overlooking the garden, and I want the pay to change too, so it corresponds to what you truly do here." Valentina looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Doña Carmen, who was observing the scene with the expression of someone who knows the end of the story and is patiently waiting for the others to reach it. "And what is it that I truly do here?" she asked. Rodrigo thought about the answer. He truly thought about it, not like someone searching for the right phrase, but like someone searching for the right truth. "You gave my mother her life back," he said, "and you reminded me how to open a door that I myself had closed." A pause. "That has no fixed price, but I'm going to try to get the number as close as possible." Doña Carmen let out a small, genuine laugh, the kind Valentina had come to love, because it sounded like someone who had regained the right to laugh at good things. Valentina turned off the heat under the eggs, served them onto 3 plates, put the tortillas in the basket, filled the coffee cups, and then, for the first time since she had arrived at that mansion with her old suitcase and wobbly wheels, she sat down to breakfast with them. Not in the service kitchen, not standing by the griddle, but there at the counter, between a man learning to come home, an old woman who had waited years to have a family again, and with the morning sun streaming through the large windows of the luxurious kitchen, illuminating the 3 coffee cups, the small vase with no paper kinship, and who, however, at that Tuesday breakfast were exactly that, a family. The end.